Good afternoon. I'm excited about welcoming you to our session on family and personal stories. This happens to be my favorite genre of stories and storytelling, so I'm going to have fun this afternoon emceeing this program and then also sharing a story with you. We're going to have a
Oh,
change on the program. Uh, Queenie Fillmore was not able to be with us today, and so we have one of our territory tellers who's very graciously agreed to step up and tell in this session. So right now I would like to introduce Chester Weems. You've seen him doing a lot of emceeing in this program for the festival, but I've known Chester for a long time and I worked with him in an education setting, and it has been fun to work with Chester in the storytelling setting. And he has a lot of wonderful ideas, and he led our organization this past year and helped us institute some new programs, and we're happy for that. So, Chester, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you share a personal or family story with us today.
well, thank you, Liz. I appreciate that. I tend to do some silly stuff, but I'm a little more serious tonight. Last weekend was Memorial Day, and that kind of brings out a lot of thoughts in us. And also, in terms of definition of personal and family stories, you can tell family stories that are not necessarily yours, and some family stories are kind of universal, or sometimes people will give you permission to tell family stories. So this kind of overlaps a couple of those areas. The only problem with this story, you have to tolerate a little bit of singing, and I can't sing either, but I'm going to do it anyway, just because I've got the camera right now. So when Johnny comes marching home again, hoorah, hoorah. When Johnny comes marching home again, hoorah, hoorah. The men will cheer, the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out, and we'll all be glad when Johnny comes marching home. When Johnny comes marching home again, a Civil War ballad about people coming back from the war, back from seeing bad things, and being greeted with cheers and so on, but knowing that they've seen and done bad things. But even though it's a Civil War ballad, doesn't it apply to about every war? Doesn't it apply to our numbered wars, 1 and 2? Wouldn't it apply to Korea, Vietnam, all those things we did in the Middle East, Afghanistan? All those cases where people have to come home and they have to tell people about what they did. Some of you may have seen the movie Private Ryan, Saving Private Ryan. Really good movie. Some of the opening sequence, some of the best recreations of battlefield scenes on that invasion has ever been made. But within that story, there's a sub story, and you may recall that there's Tom Hanks plays an officer that is a well-respected officer by his men, very well thought of, but he's kind of a mystery to them because they're trying to figure out what made him a good officer and what did he do before the war. Well, he plays along with this, and he doesn't tell them. They want to know. They try to trick him, but he just plays along, and he just flat won't tell them. They even have a pool, a money pool, trying to guess. Well, they are on a mission to save Private Ryan, basically, and there's a group of them. I don't remember the size of it, but they come across a German gun emplacement, and a firefight ensues. It's very difficult, very intense. They lose a man. All the Germans are killed except one. And then because their buddy has been killed, because I can only imagine, never having been there, but what it must be like to be in a firefight, the adrenaline must be flowing. They are all intense, and they have this prisoner now. They don't know what to do with him. Do we let him go? Do we send him somewhere? Or do we just shoot him right here? And they are arguing so much that they're almost ready to shoot each other. And Tom Hanks, in his character as the officer, steps up and says, I was an English teacher and a baseball coach. Well, him saying that was such a shock that it stopped them all. And he said, yes, I was an English teacher and I was a baseball coach. And how in the world am I going to explain to people when I get home what this was all about? Well, where I worked, we had occasional lunches. A group, there was about 40 or 50 people in our office building. About once a month we'd get together. And we often get up at these meetings and we tell little things. And I was telling about that story, about what I'd seen, how that particular subplot of Saving Private Ryan. And as I was standing there telling that story, I looked out in the audience. And over to my left a little ways sat Jess. Jess was 19 years old when he was stationed on a carrier off the coast of Vietnam. And one day a lieutenant commander came to him and said, Jess, you're an Indian. I want you to go with us on this next flight and run the radio. And in case we get shot down, you can probably get us out. And that's what he did, but he picked the wrong flight to fly. But you also have to remember that Jess was a 19-year-old kid. He might have been carrying a gun, but he was still 19 years old. They were shot down over Nam. It took them 2 weeks to walk out. He said they were having to drink water from the leaves of the trees, and monkeys in the trees made noise, and they said they shot all their ammunition. They shot all the monkeys in that part of Vietnam because they were so scared. But they finally got to the coastline. So that was not a good thing for Jess. And behind Jess, just a few feet, sat Denny. Denny didn't talk too much about it. He was our director of elementary education, had been an outstanding principal, really a good guy. But one day he happened to mention that he had served in Vietnam. And he talked to me about the feeling and the sound when you lock and load your rifle as you step into the jungle. He said after doing that, by the way, no parent ever scared him again as a principal. About 3 weeks ago, I attended Denny's funeral. Denny didn't say much about his service. I found out at the funeral he'd won the Bronze Star. And a friend there speaking about Denny said that Denny had a really tough and dangerous job that he did. And he had served with Denny, but they both had gone to Germany after their tour in Vietnam. They were still in the service. And he talked about they were in a hotel with their wives on just a little break, they had a weekend leave. And they were standing on a balcony, and there was a fireworks show not too far away. And the fireworks were lighting up the sky. And they were making all those explosion sounds that fireworks make. And it reminded them both of where they had been. And he said, Denny put his arm across my shoulder. And he said, we can sleep tonight. We don't have to be scared. Now, on the other side of the room sat Brenda. Brenda had not been in the military, but her husband was a pilot. He had been. She said that she had come to a neutral country where the military people could go for R&R. And she landed at the airport there, civilian airport, and walked into the, the meeting area. And she was looking for her husband. There was a group of men over there. And she couldn't find her husband. He was standing there all the same time as him, as it had been about 6 months since she had seen him. It's just amazing. And sometimes I think we do forget the effect those things have on family members. It certainly did on Brenda. And then about 6 months ago, we had a visitor in our home, a relative of my wife's. And he sat at my table, wheezing and coughing, told a couple of war stories about Vietnam. The wheezing and coughing, he said, was a result of being under Agent Orange. And he told about one battle he was in where 318 people walked in and 59 walked out. How do you tell the people back home what you've experienced? How do you share those stories? When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. Thank you very much. Liz, you know you're muted.
Thank you, Chester. Wow, what a message for us to remember. Thank you for sharing that. And I also know, Denny, that you were talking about a wonderful principal in our district and went on to be director of elementary education. Thank you for stepping in, Chester. Our next teller is Tony Hardman. Tony is currently serving as the library director at Oklahoma Panhandle State University, where he also teaches speech communication. And Tony's been active in community theater and storytelling out in the Panhandle since 2009. And he loves telling stories about the Oklahoma Panhandle. Tony is artist in residence at the No Man's Land Museum, where he has told ghost stories every Halloween since 2012. And let me tell you, I've heard him tell those ghost stories. He's got some pretty spooky ghost tales. He's been an active member of Territory Tellers Board since 2009, and he's going to still be on the board for this coming year. Tony, share a story with us.
Thank you. I'm glad that Liz mentioned that I was a speech teacher, because one of the story that I'm actually going to tell has to do with an experience that I had in one of my speech classes. Now, let me give you a little bit of background about how I teach. One of the things that I realize my students suffer is they are extremely afraid of getting up in front of an audience. So I organized my class so that their first 6 speeches that they have to give is automatic A's. That way they can get up, they can get used to being in front of an audience, and then when it comes time for their graded speeches, they can start applying the rules and the different things that they have learned, and that's when I actually start grading them on their speech quality. Now, there was one particular class that I had, and there was a young man that was in this class. And I had actually had this young man before, and he had dropped the class and then he was taking it again. He seemed to be very shy. He always sat off by himself. He didn't talk to a lot of people. He seemed to have very little self-confidence, and he was always dressed very sloppily. And matter of fact, so much so that I actually wondered if he was financially destitute. But during the classes, as he was giving these automatic A speeches, it was more like, okay, I'm getting up here, I'm giving the speech because I know I'm going to get an A regardless. So I emphasized, once that final speech was over, that all of the speeches from then on, they not only had to be dressed up and looking appropriate for their speech, but they had to show that they were prepared and that their speech had been practiced. And if that was not the case, that they would be penalized. And I happened to look at him as I made this comment, and I could see this expression of panic on his face. And I was wondering how he was going to handle the rest of the class. Now, the first graded speech that I assigned is a demonstration speech. Now, the reason that I do this is because I found most students seem to be comfortable getting up and demonstrating something that they know about. And then once they realize they can do that, then they can confidently give the other speeches. Now, I realize that there can be an element of controversiality in the topics of the speeches. So I always have them sign a sign-up sheet saying what their topic is and telling them that it is subject to my approval. So I passed out the sign-up sheet. I looked at his and it said his demonstration speech was going to be how to make a broccoli roll. Now, I had never heard of a broccoli roll before, so I Googled it. And it turned out that according to Google, a broccoli roll was a pastry that was made with broccoli and pasta. So I thought, oh, he's going to do a cooking demonstration. But I was a little bit confused because in his sign up, he said how to make a broccoli roll an art activity. And I was wondering how he was going to make an art activity out of a pastry made of pasta. So when it came time for him to give his speech, I was rather intrigued. Now, he got up in front of the audience, my class, and he actually was dressed quite nicely. I mean, before he was a slob. I mean, it was just awful how he dressed. He was in a nice dress shirt with a tie, he had dress slacks, he had shoes, and I says, oh, okay, he's getting the message, he understands. So he proceeded to do his demonstration speech. Now, he took a piece of rectangular paper and he said this was an art activity that his mother had taught him when he was a child, and he liked to do it because it kept his fingers nimble. So he would take a pencil and he would draw various designs, and then he would take colored pencils and he would color them in. And I'm like, okay, what does this have to do with broccoli? Well, then he pulled out of a plastic bag a stalk of the vegetable broccoli. He took a pair of scissors and he started cutting it up very, very, very fine. I mean, really fine. And then he said, okay, now what you do is you take the broccoli and you put it in the paper. Then he started to roll the paper. And then after it had been rolled, he would lick it with his tongue, just like an old-fashioned cowboy would roll an old-fashioned cigarette, but became more popularly used in 1960s when people created a marijuana joint. And it was at that moment that I realized that broccoli roll was a slang for marijuana joint. Now, of course, I was immediately concerned, but I thought, okay, he is using broccoli. He's not bringing an illegal substance to the classroom. He's not breaking the law. He's not violating a policy. And this is actually a very creative way of expressing his opinion about something. So I actually had to be impressed with him. Well, I happened to look around in the class because I noticed that several of the students were laughing. And I figured, of course, they were laughing because they knew exactly what he meant by broccoli roll. However, I happened to notice that they all had their phones out and they were recording the entire thing. And my immediate reaction was, this cannot be good. This is not going to end well. Now, my class happened to be later in the afternoon, so right after my class, I went home and I came back to work at the library the next morning. My student worker goes, wow, what do you teach them in that class? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she gets out her phone and shows me on Snapchat that one of the students who had recorded this had put it on Snapchat for the entire world to see. I went to my other class later that day and they were all, wow, we signed up for the wrong class. It looks like that's the class that has the most fun. And we all had this big discussion about the student making a broccoli roll for his demonstration speech. Well, I thought, okay, that's not too bad. Except I all of a sudden started getting calls from parents wanting to know what I was teaching their children. And if that wasn't bad enough, I got called into an emergency meeting with my dean and the academic vice president. So I walked in and again, they asked what I was teaching in my class. And I said, well, if you have seen the video, you would know that he made basically a marijuana joint, but he made it with real broccoli. He did not bring an illegal substance onto the campus. He did not break the law. He did not violate a policy. And I says, and to be honest, I thought it was a very creative way of giving a demonstration speech. And after they thought about it for a minute, they realized, yeah, you're right. Okay, nothing really has happened. And if nothing else, it was a brilliant example of parody. So I thought the matter ended. Well, next speech came along. And the next speech was for them to give a dramatic reading. And my students signed up to do the dramatic reading, where they would do a work of literature and they had to perform it in an emotional content appropriate to that particular work of literature. The day came, my student got up and stood in front of the classroom. He was dressed in a suit. And I mean, it was immaculate. He looked exactly like he had just stepped off the cover of GQ. He looked like he could have been a professional model. And he had a book with him. And he said, for my reading, I am going to read the book, Let the Children March by Monica Clark Robinson. Now, if you are not familiar with this particular children's picture book, you really should be, because it is the story of a young boy who participated in the Children's March for Civil Rights in the 1960s. And it is all told from the perspective of this young boy. He talks about meeting Martin Luther King. He talks about why it is important that the children march instead of the parents. He talks about the realization that he was participating in something very important historically. And needless to say, it is a very emotional, very powerful story. And as he read this story, I looked at my students and I could see that his performance had definitely impacted them. And when he finished the story and he closed the book, I again looked at my students. Every female student in the class had tears in their eyes, and the majority of men, you could tell, had definitely been impacted. Well, he went on to give two other great speeches. He gave a marvelous, passionate speech, persuasive speech on civil rights, and he gave a very good, effective, informative speech on the importance of athletics in school programs. Needless to say, in spite of my misgivings at the beginning of class, he was one of my top students and he got an A. But the story doesn't end with my class, because I noticed after that, there was a definite transformation that had taken place with him. Because of those two speeches where he had dressed nice and where he presented himself with eloquence, he got a lot of compliments from his classmates and from other students. He started to dress better. Now, he didn't wear a suit every day, but he dressed a lot better. He spoke with more confidence and more eloquence than he ever did before. He became involved in student government, and he became a member of some of the clubs on the campus, one of those clubs of which he was elected president. He found out that he had a certain knack for a talent of photography, and he ended up getting a job with the school newspaper. And I would see him at all of the athletic events where he was snapping pictures of players in action, and I would open up the college newspapers to see those pictures published there. But one of the biggest transformations that I had heard about was the other instructors talking about how all of a sudden he became serious about studies. And instead of getting C's and D's in his classes, he was now getting A's and B's. The story ended on May 8th of this year. I was sitting up on a stage, and I was a member of the faculty of Oklahoma Panhandle State University. And I watched as various students walked across that stage and received their diploma and honors that they had earned. And it was with a special amount of pride that I watched as he walked across that stage. And right after receiving his bachelor's degree, he was placed with a yellow cord around his neck, which meant that he had graduated with honors. And I could not help but think to myself that maybe I had a part in that successful transformation of that particular student. And I couldn't help but smile, because to me, that's what being a teacher is all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I know exactly how you feel as a teacher, and I know we have many members that are teachers now, or former teachers. Thank you for reminding us about the importance of being a teacher. Thank you. Okay, our next teller, she was our MC in the last story concert with the youth tellers. Valerie Kimball says she loves to travel, read, and tell stories. She grew up in New York City, but she has made Oklahoma her home for the last 40 years. And you know what? I'm glad that you are one of us now, Valerie. You're an Okie now, and I'm glad you've been here. Since her retirement from the public libraries, Valerie's been working with Elizabeth Ellis on her storytelling, adding personal stories to her repertoire of folk tales, myths, and literacy tales. And Valerie is a master at telling stories to very young children. If you want to know how to do it right, take one of her workshops in this area. She is fantastic. Valerie, share a story with us.
Oh, Liz, thank you so much. That was just lovely. Well, Chester and Tony have been so serious, and I'm going in an entirely different direction. My story is from long ago. When I first got married, I lived in Springer, Oklahoma, out in the country. It was a big culture shock. And we had lots of animals, dogs, cats, horses, cows, you name it. Well, it was a really brutally hot August morning. It was Saturday. My husband at the time, Bob, had gone off to work. He was a mud engineer. Those of you who know, that's an oil field job that's 24/7. So I was relaxing in the air conditioning. I didn't have any reason to go outside until the phone rang. I answered it. Come quick, come quick. Your horse is drowning in our stock tank. You have to come save her. Seriously? 100-pound woman saving a 1,000-pound horse? Hi, Mrs. Drain, I said to my closest neighbor. Thanks for calling. I didn't know Susie had gotten out. It had to be Susie. Mrs. Drain, by any chance, is the horse's head going under the water? Under the water? No, no, dear. It's going across. Across. Mrs. Drain, she's swimming. Swimming? My lands, swimming? Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry she bothered you. As soon as Bob gets home from work, we'll come get her. Oh, and I'll go out and see about that fence. I'll make sure your cows don't get out. Oh, no, dear. We don't have any cows in that pasture. That fence is unreliable. No kidding. Well, we hung up and I put shoes on and went and got the hammer out of the kitchen drawer. And I looked toward the dogs and the cat. They hadn't even moved a muscle. So out I went out the back door and oh my gosh, it was like stepping into an oven. You know what those Oklahoma summers are like. There's no air. I made it across the yard and there, the gate between the yard and the pasture, it was one of those aluminum gates, those big aluminum gates with the slide closure. Except ours was reinforced with baling wire because Susie, the horse that got out, she can open any gate. She made the rounds every morning. She would stand and she would bang her nose against the gate. And that aluminum slide, it would obligingly slide open and the gate would swing. So all of our gates were wrapped with baling wire. When I took it off, that one, I took it with me. I figured in my fence repair, it might come in handy. Plus there was no Susie to get in the yard. I stepped out into the pasture past the old Jeep that we used as a farm truck. And I thought, well, I'd better check on our cows. So I headed closer to our pond and I didn't have to go very far. They were all there. They were all smashed into the little lozenge of shade that was provided by the one scraggly tree. They were standing nose to tail with the tails going like windshield wipers to get rid of the flies. I did a quick cow census and they were all there. So I headed toward the fence line that separated our pasture from the drains. I walked along the fence. I didn't have to go very far. There was the scene of the crime. The top wire of a whole section was lying on the ground. I knew exactly what had happened. Susie had picked out a section and she had pressed her muscular quarter horse chest against the top wire between two of the barbs. And she leaned and she leaned. And then she put her head over and she began to graze on the far side. Farther and farther. Well, you know, a barbed wire is not supposed to withstand 1,000 pounds. So of course the staple popped out and the wire landed up on the ground and Susie stepped over and headed off on an adventure. I picked up the wire and there was an old rusty staple still stuck in it. And I pressed it into the closest fence post, which was leaning over, but it wasn't going to stay. Luckily, I had my baling wire. So I wrapped it around and I thought, that's good enough. The fence was still pretty unreliable, but at least it was better than it was. And by this time, I was just drenched. I had to get back in that air conditioning. Well, about 5 o'clock, I heard Bob's company car come over the cattle guard. I looked over. The dogs and the cats still didn't want to get up. So I went out, and he was already on the back porch pulling off one boot. Oh, I felt so sorry for him. His hair was soaking wet. Sweat was running in a cataract from his head down, and his shirt was soaked and stuck to his chest. There were even dark wet patches on his jeans. Ugh. And from his knee to the hem, those jeans, they were just disgusting. It looked like he'd waded through mud. Bob, you're going to have to put that boot back on. He turned and he was hostile. What do you mean? I'm sorry. Susie's out and we have to go get her. I told him about the phone call. He didn't even laugh. Get in the Jeep, he said. Now, I was really not dressed for horse wrangling. I had shorts and flip-flops on, but you don't argue with a tired man covered in sweat and mud. So I went out and I got in the Jeep. He followed. And while he was getting in, I looked in the back of the truck, and we didn't have a rope. And I knew Susie didn't have a halter. The only things in the back of that Jeep were a tow chain and a toolbox. But I didn't say anything. He said, "Which way?" And I pointed toward the area of the fence that had been down, and we bounced over the pasture to the fence, and he got out. He took one look at my shoddy repair, and then he picked up his boot and he just kicked that post, and the whole fence lay down. It had gotten even more unreliable. He got back in the truck, put it in gear, and we bounced over, avoiding the barbs. He didn't have to ask which way. There had not been any cows in that pasture for a while. The grass was knee-high, but there was a lovely Susie-sized trail broken in the grass. We followed in. Now, the Drains pasture was level with ours for a little distance, and then it sloped down. And when we got to the top of that slope, we looked, and it was a very pretty view. There was that Olympic swimming pool-sized cow pond. It was huge. It was gorgeous. I wouldn't mind swimming in it myself. And grazing next to it, in a pool of lovely afternoon sunlight, was Susie. Her lovely bay coat was glowing red in the afternoon sun. Her long black tail was swishing. Of course, when she heard the truck, she picked up her head and looked at us suspiciously. Bob said, "Go get her." Great. Go get her. No rope, no halter, not even reliable shoes. Now, I had seen him a million times take off his belt and put it around her neck and lead her somewhere. He didn't offer me the belt. Well, I got out and I began walking. My main concern was to keep my shoes on, because that long grass, it was sharp. It was really hard to walk through, and it kept stealing my shoes. I was very distracted. Plus, I was wondering a little bit about how many chiggers and ticks I was requiring in this little jaunt. But I went on, and Susie waited for me. And that was the reason I had been elected. Bob, you see, considered Susie a working horse. If he approached her, she knew she would have to work. Plus, in the angry state he was in, she would have run from him. Me, on the other hand, she was my pet. I gave her treats, I scratched her in good places, I brushed her. Yeah, she let me walk right up to her. And because I didn't have anything else, I put my arms around her neck and I laced my fingers together. And I was leaning against her shoulder, making sure my feet avoided hers. And she just rested her big old heavy head on my shoulder. And we were standing there cheek to cheek, eyeball to eyeball. And I said, "Oh, Susie." She swiveled that fuzzy ear my way. And I said, "You are in so much trouble." Obviously, the swim and the day alone had been worth it. And then we heard the truck start up. So we both turned to look. And here came the Jeep. It came in a big circle, and Bob stopped it with the tailgate directed our way. He got out and he lowered the tailgate. I was surprised. And then he reached in and he got that tow chain and he began to drag it out over that metal tailgate. That tow chain was as thick as my wrist. I couldn't lift it. He dragged it right over and he encircled her neck with it and hooked it. And then he said to me, "Go sit on the tailgate." So I inched out from between them and I went and sat on the tailgate and he led her to me. Of course, he was muttering all kinds of bad things, but she still didn't look very worried. He handed me the chain. It took both hands for me to hold it. And then he bent over and he started throwing the excess chain back into the Jeep. And without a word, he got in and he put it in gear and he started off. Now, it took two hands to hold the chain. I didn't have any hand to hold on to the tailgate. So as he accelerated over that pasture, bumping along, Susie went from a walk to a trot, from a trot to a canter, to a lope, to a gallop. We were going pretty fast, and there was a lot of daylight between me and the tailgate. "Bob, slow down." "She can run." "Yes, she's running just fine. She's enjoying it. You're gonna lose me." He slowed down a little bit. We got back to our pasture and Bob took the chain off and whacked her on the butt. And she went off to terrorize the cows, none of the worse for coming home in chains and bondage. And he and I fixed that fence. So at least that night, it would be a little reliable. And we both hoped that it would be at least a few weeks before Susie got bored again. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. I didn't know you had been a farm girl for a while. Thank you for that story. That I see you in a whole different light now. Okay, our next teller is Molly Lemons. Molly's been telling family and personal stories since she retired from teaching in the Mustang School District. And she's the author of 6 published books. And she takes many of her stories from one of those books. Molly loved growing up during the 1940s and 50s. And Molly says to people, come smile, laugh, or cry as I tell you a story when a time when life was as it should be. Molly, share one of your stories with us, please.
Thank you, Liz. I don't think there's anybody alive that doesn't have a memory of a Christmas that they could never, ever forget. And that's one I have. December 1950, when I was 13 years old. Every single year on Christmas, we went to my grandparents in Crandall, Texas, which was a little town about 25 miles east of Dallas, where my mother grew up, graduated with all 10 of her siblings. And the population was about 600, and most of them were her relatives. So we'd all go there, and they had a big, my grandfather was a rancher. We called him Papa Dear, and we called our grandmother Mama Dear. And so Mama Dear would fix all this food for 50 people every year at Christmas, as everybody brought their spouse and all their kids. And anybody that helped on the ranch came, they were included too, a lot of help. So I was 13 years old, and I don't know, you girls, you can remember being 13. You got out of the area that you were a child and you were becoming a woman, and you were just so proud of it. And so one of the things I got to do, for one thing, when we went to Mama Dear and Papa Dear's every year, they expected us to dress for the occasion. I mean, really dress. So I was getting kind of big for my britches, and I decided I wanted to have some nylon hose. Well, the war was over and nylon was back in production, and you began to get nylon hose, but they came in 2 pieces with a seam down the back. And there was absolutely nothing in the more unladylike than to have your seams twisted around to the front or the back, and the nylons bagging around your legs. Well, 13-year-old doesn't have too many hips to hold up anything, but to hold up those 2 pieces of nylon was what we called a garter belt. And mine was a little white satin one with lace on it, and I thought it was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen. Had little tabs on it, and it held the hose up. I was so excited getting to go be my woman coming out party that year at Christmas. Mother also got me a little pair of heels about 1.5 inches high. And I practiced walking in them and practiced wearing those stupid hose. But you know, you're supposed to like it because you're a lady, right? Okay. Well, I got them all fixed up and straight. And I spent half my time running to the restroom, turning them around because they were always somewhere else. Well, Mama Dear rang the little bell in the kitchen, and all 50 people gathered around from the living room into the kitchen, around down the hall. 50 people made a big circle around that enormous dining room table for Papa Dear to say the prayer. Well, right slap dab in the middle of the prayer, I began to feel that garter belt begin to slide and slide, got back down to my knees, which that put my hose in a little rippled pile around my ankles. So there wasn't anything to consider about a seam in the back because it was piled on the floor. Well, I had my head bowed, and I looked through my eyebrows, and everybody had their head bowed and their eyes closed. I thought, well, nobody will see me. I'll just fix this situation. So I pulled my skirt up and worked that thing back up like this, you know, and I got it about halfway up, and I heard a giggle. Well, I had a little cousin, 10 years old, and she wanted to be grown up so bad, and she thought I was really showing out, and she followed me the whole time. You're not big enough to wear those, Molly Lou. You're still a little girl like me. You shouldn't wear those. And she popped my bra and mess on my the way up whatever I was wearing and make a big deal. Well, she burst out laughing right in the middle of the prayer. Oh no. So I just kind of froze where I was, and everybody opened their eyes and looked, and there was Molly Lou, standing with her dress hiked up, pulling up her garter belt, with her hose hanging down around her legs, her knees and ankles, and everybody laughed. Well, it had a little bit of stretch in it, so when it got around my feet, it was like a big old rubber band holding my ankles together. So I hopped to the bathroom, all the way out with everybody dying laughing, dragging my hose behind me, still attached to the garter. I go in the bathroom, And I started crying. I don't want to be a woman anymore. This isn't any fun. Well, Mother came in to check on me, and she sat down on the edge of the tub, and she said, "Molly Lou," she said, "it's okay. It's just okay. Someday you'll really laugh about this." No, I won't ever laugh about this. But I did. That's it.
I remember those garter belt days, Molly.
Oh boy.
I'm going to close our session today with a personal story. Chester mentioned earlier in the day at our general meeting about a workshop that we did with Elizabeth Ellis about using poetry in your stories. So I called this story "The New York Yankees and the Crochet Hook," and I'd like to start the story with the poem that I wrote. It sat on the end table next to my father's overstuffed chair, no bigger than a bread box. I could twist a knob and bring magic into our living room. Voices like, "Hi-O Silver," "The Shadow Knows," "Another case closed, King," leapt from the box, beckoning me to mesh with the voices' adventures. After the supper dishes were done, and before the final call bedtime, I sat in front of the box, hugging my knees, listening, painting pictures in my mind no movie set could ever reproduce. Evening after evening, I was held spellbound by the sounds from the magic box. I longed to be that child again, free from real adventures, safely hugging my knees, sitting mesmerized in front of the magic box. Now, I was the child in that poem during the 1940s and into the 50s, and nothing since has been able to stimulate my imagination quite like the radio could. I would listen to programs and I could see every character and every setting in my mind. When some of the stories from the radio started to transition to television, I was disappointed several times because what I was seeing on television was not nearly as good as what I had pictured in my imagination. And even after television became a permanent fixture in most homes, the radio remained an important part of my daily life. Yes, the radio really helped stimulate my imagination, but it also gave me shared experiences with my big brother. And we listened to a lot of the same programs. You know, we'd listen to Superman, The Shadow Knows, Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, the Cisco Kid, and the Lone Ranger. And many times my big brother would make sure he would explain things to me that he thought I didn't understand. You see, he was 8.5 years older than me, and he was truly my big brother. He was 6'8" tall, and he was my hero. He played basketball and baseball, and I spent many happy hours as a child sitting in the bleachers cheering him on. He always played summer baseball, and it seemed like they had baseball games almost every night. Now, my parents could go to all the games, but I could. And sometimes my brother would agree to take me with him to a ball game. I didn't really know the ins and outs of the game, but that didn't matter. I was with my big brother. When games were over, he would hold my hand as we walked back to the car. And I will tell you, no little girl ever felt more safe and secure. Now, in the fall, there was a special event where I could spend time with my brother listening to the radio. Of course, my brother listened to the World Series games. He was an avid New York Yankees fan, therefore, so was I. And we had plenty of chances to cheer for them as we were growing up. Because between 1921 and 1958, the New York Yankees won 18 World Series titles. But it is the World Series of 1952 that is stuck in my mind. The Yankees were playing the Baltimore the Brooklyn Dodgers, I'm sorry, they were playing the Brooklyn Dodgers that year, and they were having a tough time. They were trying to win their 4th series in a row, but they were behind the Brooklyn Dodgers 3-2. So when it was coming into that 6th game of the World Series, they were in a tough spot. If they lost that game, then the Brooklyn Dodgers had won the series and would reign as baseball kings for a whole year. If they won it, they still had a chance to win the series. It was tense around our house that day when we were getting ready to listen to that ball game. I know it was a Saturday because we were not in school. And I abandoned my outdoor play to come in and listen to the game with my brother. Oh, he was tense. He couldn't sit still. He would sit down and jump up. He would pace back and forth in the living room. And when the Yankees made a positive play, he would be cheering and yelling. And if they made mistakes, he was moaning and groaning. It was a sight to watch. It was entertaining to watch. Now, my mother was doing her normal chores around the house, and she was working in the kitchen, baking chocolate chip cookies twice a week. She baked a double batch of chocolate chip cookies, and Saturday was always one of those days. This was a special Saturday because she was also baking a 2-layer chocolate cake. And every once in a while, she would come into the living room to listen to the baseball game with us for a little while. Now, normally she would sit in her rocking chair, but that day she sat in my father's big chair that was right next to the radio. Now, you have to understand that my mother never just sat there with her hands idle in her lap. If she did sit down, she was working on something. She would either crochet, embroidery, or do the handwork on a dress she was making for her or for me. That day, she was crocheting with a crochet hook like this. She would sit there and listen to the game and crochet for a while. Then she would take her crocheting and lay it on the wide arm of the chair and go back to her work in the kitchen. When she was in the kitchen like that, my brother would yell, "Mom," until she stuck her head out the door. And then he would tell her some wonderful thing that the Yankees had done. Well, after a couple of times of that, she totally ignored him, didn't pay any attention to his screaming and yelling or his hollering. She went on with work. And after a while, I kind of got, bored with all of his antiques. And I found a place in the living room out of the way of his pacing and played with my paper dolls. And as I was putting clothes on the paper dolls, I heard my brother yell at the Yankees, "What do you think you're doing?" I looked up, and my brother sat down on the arm of the chair and immediately jumped up and screamed, "Mom!" There was a particular urgency in his voice. And when he turned around, I understood why. There stood my brother with a crochet hook sticking out of his rear. When I saw that, I started screaming. My mother was ignoring him, but when she heard both of us screaming, she came into the living room. The side of her 6'8" son bent over with the crochet hook sticking out of his rear. Now, I'm glad that my mother always remained calm in a crisis because neither my brother or I were calm. My brother was yelling, pull it out. And my mother was saying, no, we can't do that because it will do more injury coming out. We have to see a doctor. My mother called the doctor at his home and he said, bring him into his office. I'd never seen my big brother cry, but I did that day. It was a painful process getting him out to the car and into the car. He had to climb into the car facing backwards. He rode to the doctor's office, facing backwards, laying over the front seat with his rear end sticking up in the air. I have no idea what people must have thought when they drove by us and saw this sight with the crochet hook sticking out. We got to the doctor's office and it was another painful event getting out of the car and into the doctor's office. And as soon as we walked in, the doctor was standing there with his nurse, and their first question was, "How did you get a crochet hook stuck in your rear?" My mother went back to the examining room with my brother, but the little sister had to stay in the waiting room. It seemed like an eternity before my brother came hobbling out, followed by my mother carrying her crochet hook. I got my brother into the car for the ride home. When we got home, the baseball game was over. Oh, the Yankees won, but my brother had missed their moment of victory. He had to miss a few days of school, but he didn't mind that. My mother, when we got him home, got him settled in bed on his stomach with an ice pack on his rear and an extra big serving of chocolate cake. Now, I stayed around doing his bidding for a while, but I was a storyteller even back then. So I went out into the neighborhood to tell everybody about my brother and the crochet hook. Then I came home and waited in the front yard for my father to come home from work so I could be the first one to tell him the story. After the supper, everybody finished supper in the neighborhood. Neighbors wandered over to check on my brother. And I think his ego was bruised a little bit when he realized that I had broadcast his predicament to the entire block. Because he had to stay home on his stomach, he got to be there and hear the seventh game of that World Series. The Yankees won, even though my brother couldn't jump around cheering, they won that game, and it gave them their 15th World Series up to that time. That was 70 years ago. My brother went on to become a high school science teacher, and he coached basketball and baseball and swimming. His life was intertwined with sports his entire career. I also went into teaching, but I went a different route, a different competitive route. I taught speech and drama and debate. And my brother remained an avid New York Yankee fan all of his life. He would watch their regular games on TV, and of course, he would watch their games if they were in the World Series. He would watch those on TV. Now, I, on the other hand, am not a big baseball enthusiast. I very seldom watch regular pro baseball games on television. But in the fall, if the Yankees are playing in the World Series, my heart is pulled toward the game. And interestingly enough, I really don't want to watch the game on TV. I would rather listen to it on the radio. You see, I become that child again, sitting in front of the magic box, hugging my knees, listening to the game, and reaching out to hold the hand of my hero, my big brother, Bill Cole. Thank you for joining us for this concert this afternoon. We had a variety of family personal stories, and I enjoyed every single one. Thank you, Chester. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Valerie and Molly, for joining in this concert. Love all of you and appreciate you sharing their talents. Remember, check back in at 7 o'clock tonight. We have a wonderful, wonderful program on tap. Chester, is there anything you would like to say about everything tonight, all the activities tonight?
Well, so far as everything has been great, and I expect it tonight. Watching David Goodrow is going to be a real treat. And of course, we all know that Laura is first class, so
Yes.
we should have a good evening.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you at the activities tonight.
Thank you.